don't want people to be worried about how to write a data management plan. We want them to be worried about how to manage their data. And then writing the plan should be the easy part. So this is sort of the elements, suggested elements is just a sort of, it's like a framework that you can work through. And the idea is that if you answer all of those, if you sort of address each of those issues conscientiously, you should come out with a pretty good data management plan. But it's not required. Then we have additional requirements and guidance from each of those programs. So it's inherently a sort of two-tiered policy. There's the requirements that apply across the Office of Science, but then there are some programs that have decided, because there are already community standards, for example, for some of their research communities, that they wanted to impose additional requirements or just have some additional guidance to sort of explain in their community's language what all of this means. And so each of those programs has a web page with additional information. We also have links to information at our scientific user facilities. So I'll go into this in a little bit. I'll just reserve those comments. And then some definitions, FAQs, and references. Okay, so first the principles. The first principle is that effective data management has the potential to increase the pace of scientific discovery and promote more efficient and effective use of government funding and resources. Data management planning should be an integral part of research planning. Sharing and preserving data are central to protecting the integrity of science by facilitating the validation of results, and to advancing science by broadening the value of research data to disciplines other than the originating one and to society at large. And finally, not all data need to be shared or preserved, and there's some kind of cost-benefit weighing that you have to do. So before I launch into the requirements, a few caveats. So the first one is that these requirements apply only to proposals submitted for research funding. So if you submit a proposal to have a workshop, or you submit a proposal to build a widget, these requirements don't apply. It's only for research funding. They apply to proposals for new, renewal, and some supplemental funding. So the rule of thumb is if your proposal is going to be sent out for review because you're proposing some new scope of research, then it should have a data management plan that at least corresponds to that new scope. They apply regardless of where the PI is located, so whether they're at a national laboratory, at a university, or an industry. They do not apply for the proposals that someone would submit to have access to our user facilities. So in general, that application process is managed by the user facility, wherever in whatever lab they might be hosted, and not by the Office of Science. So this is only for the proposals that are coming into the Office of Science. And there are some research efforts, particularly at our national laboratories, where a proposal might have been submitted 10 years ago, and since then they've sort of just been getting renewals. And in those cases, just the way that the triggering mechanism for when they have to require when they have to submit a data management plan is a little bit different. We do it at the next time that they go through a peer review. So, the requirements. All proposals submitted to the Office of Science for research funding must include a data management plan, and the data management plan should describe whether and how data generated in the course of the proposed research will be shared and preserved. And if the plan is not to share or preserve certain data, then the plan has to explain the basis for that decision. And at a minimum, data management plans must describe how data sharing and preservation will enable the validation of results, or how the results could be validated in some other way. So, for example, if the best way to validate the results is to rerun the experiment and compare with a certain limited data set, then that's how then you should provide the data that enables that. If the best way to validate the results is to rerun the entire analysis from a data set that perhaps cannot be reproduced, then that's what you should aim to enable. This second requirement came directly from guidance from our federal advisory committees. So this is not specifically in the OSTP memo, it came from our federal advisory committees. And this says that data management plans should provide a plan for making all research data displayed in publications resulting from the proposed research open, machine readable, and digitally accessible at the time of publication. So we were hearing from some of our advisory committees that basically they're blowing up a PDF and reading off the points, maybe in some slightly more high-tech fashion, but that's just not acceptable. And so the idea is that if, as an author of a publication, you're prepared to show certain data to your reader, you should also be prepared to let that reader, manipulate them in a digital way. And so you have to provide those data along with the publication. We focus on the data displayed in the publication more than the data, that kind of goes into that, underneath that, because in many of our fields, you scratch the surface on that plot and you get a petabyte. And financially, we just cannot enable the public to have access to a petabyte of data. Okay, this next requirement also came from our federal advisory committees and working with our user facilities, and this is really meant to safeguard the user facilities from becoming data centers by default and having implicit unfunded mandates. So this says that data management plans should consult and reference available information about data management resources to be used in the course of the proposed research. In particular, data management plans that explicitly or implicitly commit data management resources at a facility beyond what is conventionally made available to approved users should be accompanied by a written approval from that facility. And so what we've done is we have asked each of our user facilities to make it very clear what data management resources they will provide to approved users. And so you'll find on our website, this is just a screenshot, a link to all of those pages at the user facilities. So now it's all transparent. So now when researchers are writing their data management plan, they can go here and say, okay, now I know if I'm doing research at this facility, I can have scratch storage for 6 months, but there's no expectation that the facility will provide, preservation or provide any help with access. And reviewers can consult these pages. User facilities hopefully are answering fewer questions on the phone. And so this helps to make all those expectations transparent. Okay, the fourth requirement is just a legal, it's legal language. It says don't do anything silly or illegal. And don't get yourself in trouble and don't get the department in trouble. And then the data management plan is going to be reviewed as part of the overall proposal. And as I said, additional requirements can apply depending on which program you're applying to. So a couple of definitions. This is our definition of digital research data. We inherited it from the OSTP memo and from other preceding documents. A couple of things to note, I won't read it out, but a couple of things to note is one is it does include software and code. So software and code are considered to be part of data, and so they should be considered in the data management plan. And also it focuses on the data necessary to validate the research findings. So we're not necessarily talking about the data that you generate when your sample is incorrectly placed in the machine or when you're debugging your code. This is the data that the researcher determines is evidence for their research findings. Data preservation means providing for the usability of data beyond the lifetime of the research activity that generated it. Data sharing means making data available to people other than those who have generated them. So this covers a really wide spectrum of options. This could be everything from you put your data on a website and people can download it without your knowledge, without having to ask permission, or it could mean that you hold your data, at your institution's server in such a way that you can respond to ad hoc requests. And we made sure that the data sharing definition was broad enough to cover all of the different types of data that we wanted to cover. We didn't want people to just talk about that very tip of the iceberg in their data management plan. We wanted them to talk about all of it. And then validate. This is also a term that we inherited, and it's the English language definition of validate. It's not the computational science definition. It's not as precise as some of the definitions of reproducibility that were mentioned earlier this morning, but this just means that someone else can come along and determine the legitimacy of your findings in whatever manner you determine is the best way. So just a little bit now about that suggested elements for a data management plan. Not all of our data management plans are using this. That's absolutely fine, but some are. And we've heard that it's somewhat useful. So, of course, you're asked to talk about the data types and sources, the content and format, of course, how you plan to share and preserve those data, any protection that you might need to put on those data. So that's for things like limited data, or if there's PII, personal information in the data. That in our space that happens pretty rarely, but in any case, there's a place for that. And then finally, rationale. And it turns out this is actually a very helpful thing to address in the data management plan. So that's a place where the researcher can say, I would have loved to put my data in this type of repository, but none exist. Or it would be great if there were data standards so that I could share my data with my colleagues in a way that made sense, but none exist. Or I, had an idea to do something really spectacular with my data, but when I costed it out, it was more than, double. It would have doubled the research budget or something. So anyway, so that turns out to be really helpful because it really shows us how the researchers are thinking about their data, and also gives us a lot of information back about potential gaps. One of the other things that the department has done is we have a mechanism for providing digital object identifiers, DOIs, for data coming out of DOE research. So this is actually something run by our Office of Scientific and Technical Information, which is, in terms of the management line, it's within the Office of Science, but functionally it serves the entire department. So anybody with DOE funding can apply for a DOI, and there are a number of large projects that have done that, but we're starting to see some small projects coming as well, and we think this is going to be really important for discoverability. And so then just a little bit about how the rubber actually meets the road. So this is a screenshot from one of our open solicitations. We actually refer to it as the open solicitation. It's the solicitation, sort of catch-all solicitation that's open for the entire year. And anyone can apply to for any of those subject areas that I mentioned. And it instructs the researcher to put their data management plan in as an appendix, Appendix 6. And then we cut and pasted the requirements that I went through into this guidance. So that's what the researcher sees in the funding opportunity announcement. And then how it's reviewed. So underneath the criterion for scientific and technical merit of the proposed research, there's a question for the reviewers. So there's a question that the reviewers are asked to answer. Oh, I touched it. Never mind. And that says, is the data management plan suitable for the proposed research, and to what extent does it facilitate or support the validation of research results? So that's pretty much as vanilla as it's going to get. That's the sort of minimum standard for what we would ask of a reviewer. If there are more targeted solicitations that are about, for example, a particular type of simulation research, or a particularly data-intensive research activity, this might well get more focused, or there might be a higher standard in terms of what they expect from the researchers. But this is all in the solicitation and known to the researchers in advance. And then this is my final slide, and it's just some references that I thought would be useful, because I didn't have a lot of time to go into all the different ways in which data is really driving a lot of the ways in which the Office of Science communities are thinking about their research. So the management of data, the ways in which data, deficiencies in data management are creating bottlenecks to discovery, new expectations for environments for data analytics and data sharing. All of these things are really driving directions for the research in the Office of Science. And these are just some of the reports that you can read that give more detail on that. That's it. Thank you.
We'll take questions now. So, yeah. So we just are going to take a few questions now. Are there any questions? Marseille? The microphone is coming to you.
Sure.
Hi, Laura.
Hi.
I couldn't fail to notice the language say should. Why?
As opposed to must, or on pain
Yeah.
of death?
Yeah. I mean, the data management plan is a requirement, right?
Yeah.
Yet the different elements is qualified as should. Could you explain a little bit the rationale?
Our lawyers told us that should is as good as must, and it's under the heading requirements, so do it.
Can I just make a comment on that? My name is Willow Dressel, and I work at the Princeton Plasma Physics Lab, which is a DOE's Office of Science lab, and we are working as hard as we can to comply with all the shoulds.
Wait, there's one more. I'm sorry, just a question before you, then you're next. I'm sorry. Marseille?
Yes, I just wonder how much you've compared with the other federal agencies that they have been doing data management plan requirements to see if it's making any difference. Do you have any data from, or have you look at it, what the other ones have done and how is impacting already or not?
Yeah, so we have. We, throughout, so I should have made that clear actually. So the OSTP memo drawed very heavily, for example, on the experience of NIH and NSF, who already had data management plan requirements or something similar. At that time, at the time that the OSTP discussions were going on, they didn't really have enough information under their belt to say, you know, how the needle was moving. But since then, we've had at least sort of informal discussions about that. And even within the Office of Science, we can tell that the needle is moving. I mean, we've only been implementing this since October 1st. So we've only had data management plans coming in since October 1st. And we can already see that people are on the learning curve. You know, the data management plans are getting more thorough. They're getting feedback from their program managers about what programs like to see in a data management plan. And so I think this is actually having an effect in terms of, at least in terms of integrating data management into the full research planning process.
I have a question about the preservation of the data. You passed over that point quite quickly. And it's, I can't remember exactly the phrasing, but it says the data must be preserved for the lifetime, the useful lifetime of the project or something like that. What is your expectation of what is a reasonable length of preservation? Is it forever, or are there considerations about what is the acceptable length of preservation?
So there are actually two timescales that are important when you think about data sharing and preservation. And one of them is, the longer of the two is how long should the data be preserved? That was your question. And the other one is the short timescale of for how long do researchers potentially have exclusive access? We don't specify either of those at the Office of Science level. Some of the programs do specify the short time scale, you know, the length of time that researchers would have exclusive access. The long time scale, we sort of can't. I mean, there are legal reasons why we can't, because we have limited oversight once a project is done, and also financial reasons why we can't really say forever or something like that. And so it's really up to the peer review process. The researcher should describe what they're going to do with the data. My guess is that a lot of times that'll involve a handoff either to an institutional repository or to a community repository or some other place. They can also actually, there's a prompt where they can say a decision will be made at some later point. You know, you're going to use certain criteria to determine whether or not the data should be kept 5 years out or something like that. So,
okay. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
I can take it. Thank you. Okay. Thank you very much. Okay. All right. All right, our next speaker is Dr. Anita De Ward. She is an ultra-low temperature physicist, and she joined Elsevier as a physics publisher in 1988. Some of her major projects at Elsevier have included co-organizing a series of workshops with the goal of enunciating the key possibilities and impediments to change scientific communications. This has included Beyond the PDF and Force 11, The Future of Research, Communications, and E-Science. In her current role at Elsevier, she, in the Research Data Services Group, She's interested in developing cross-disciplinary frameworks for sharing research data and making experimental collections available to scientists. And as such, she is involved in a series of practical projects to implement more methodical methods of data storage and working with data repositories to develop scalable models of curation. So, Dr. De Ward, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for inviting me. Is my microphone's okay? This has been a fabulous symposium, and it's really a great joy to be here and meet with many of you. I was just trying to put up the title of the symposium, and I couldn't help notice that, is there a subliminal message in these drop-downs? Search and find research support for libraries and archives. I'm wondering if that's a secret subliminal message, but I think it's a great symposium and a great topic. So I work on research data collaborations. I collaborate with scientists, with data centers, with libraries, with many different groups to explore what research data management might look like. So I'm in a research role within Elsevier, essentially. I actually became very intrigued by the matter, how has science changed? Last month I was at a workshop in London that was organized by the Royal Society to celebrate 350 years of scholarly publishing, of course starting with the Philosophical Transactions, and there was a beautiful copy of the first issue out there, and it is absolutely a delight to read some of these stories that were in the Philosophical Transactions. There's an extract of a letter made in the ordering of silkworms by Mr. Dudley Palmer from Virginia, for instance. And there was an article, I love this, it said of the way of killing rattlesnakes, but then an editor changed it, of a way of killing rattlesnakes. It was not the only way of killing rattlesnakes. You let them sniff pennyroyal. And then there was something that we would recognize much more to be science, a spot in one of the belts of Jupiter, where Mr. Hooke noticed that there was a spot that was moving from east to west across Jupiter. So I think what's really remarkable when you read these first issues, and I really urge you all to check them out because they're entertaining and wonderful, is that we have the sense that these were individuals talking to each other. These were people who didn't know each other, and they found remarkable things happening all around them, and they wanted to communicate them. And that was really the birth of science publishing. And now, of course, we can say, well, today it's very, very different. Today, science is done by big groups who communicate with big groups. It's not a one-on-one endeavor anymore. Although I think, in fact, there are elements of science that are still very much individual to individual. In reading through this article about Mr. Hooke, there was a beautiful article that you can also read. Monsieur Azout commented on the microscopes and that Hooke had built, and he was very surprised that his engine was published on a mere theory without having made any experiments, though that might have been made with a little charge and great speed. So this is one of the first, open peer reviews, if you will, open post-publication peer reviews that was non-anonymous, criticizing the method and the development right back there 350 years ago. And similarly, I think if we look at a modern paper, this is something in elementary particle physics. There's an article which is much more modern, but you see that still inside of scientific papers there is still a lot of personal narrative that happens. So this author actually talks about a theory that he sees, and he says, in the rest of this note, which is how he describes his paper, we show that while these are some beautiful ideas, the ideas of his colleagues that he just outlined, the above analysis hides some important subtleties. And I think it's a beautiful kind of poke at the research that went above it. So what I want to argue is that I think there is very much, when we're talking about data, we're talking about sharing the outputs of a collective. But often this is still used by individuals. It's used by individuals to speak with other individuals about a particular point. And I think it's very important when we talk about data integration and data sharing, and I promise you most of my talk will be about that, this is meant to enable individuals to communicate with each other about their ideas. I was very interested in the talk about the humanities, where of course the presence of the individual is much more noticed. and made much more explicit in the ways that that experimental scientists write. It's generally much more passive. You don't use I and me and my opinion, but of course still these are human beings thinking together. It's just a small comment. So I think one of the big questions we have when we think about data management and data sharing is how do you unify the needs of the collective and the individual? And I've come up with sort of an overall goal of my work and my department's work to support the development of radical new ideas, because really that's what drives science, while allowing attribution to claims and evidence anchored in a substrate of integrated data by collectively creating nimble and robust systems of knowledge management. And I added the last bullet for all citizens. After hearing Saeed Choudhury's wonderful keynote yesterday, because I think what we're doing collectively, and this is all the parties that are part in this whole discussion, is to build something, to build systems that allow us, that allow everyone really on the planet access to some of this scholarly knowledge. And last year I was at a workshop where John Perry Barlow gave an introduction. He's an incredibly interesting guy. I urge you to Google him if you don't know about him. But he said our goal, and this was the goal of the hypothesis workshop where we were developing systems of citation and better ways of hyperlinking, was let us endeavor to build systems that allow a kid in Mali who wants to learn about proteomics to not be overwhelmed by the irrelevant and the untrue. And I just think that's a wonderful, lofty goal and something sort of to strive for. So, all right, well, putting that all the way out there, I wanted to talk about three topics, and actually I kind of highlighted them in color in case you're wondering about the color. I'm interested in new systems of citation. I'm interested in better ways of integrated data, and interested in better ways of creating scientific software. So those are the 3 points I'll briefly touch on. So I think one problem that we're facing in today's system, and when we're talking what is this integrated data linking into, is that the paper is still the overarching modus operandi, and very much appreciative of the DOI viewpoint, but I think that the existence of data is a different entity than a paper, and this becomes explicit when you look at, say, identifiers for data versus identifiers for papers. The authorship isn't the same. The granularity isn't the same. The data is not as stable. It's a very different beast from a paper. But of course, all our systems of publishing are focused on papers. And I think one way in which we haven't caught up with current models of attributing claims and linking to evidence is that citations are still to papers. They're not to thoughts. You cite the top of a paper. This is a paper about the standard model of particle physics, and it cites the whole paper. And yet inside that paper is a specific claim that is based on specific data. And it would be much better if we were to say this particular thought is derived from this other thought that is embedded within this paper, or that is a connection of claims within a paper that is linked to a particular data set. So I believe that we should enable with our, and technically it's possible, but also with the infrastructures we build, to build such claim evidence networks where you can cite to a more granular unit of thought or unit of data. And secondly, similarly, the data that is being cited to is presented as pictures and not as data. We have this flat, dead way of citing data right now. It does go to tables, it does go to images, and there should be much richer ways of linking to this data. So there are some small steps that are maybe getting a bit better. Here's an example that my colleague Hilke Koers has actually been working on, where you have some journals, and I'm using an Elsevier example for obvious reasons, but many other publishers have done similar things, and I think it's improving what we're doing, where you actually have a data set inside, in this case, a marine geology journal, and there is a supplementary data set at a data repository called Pangea. And these are both concomitantly submitted to the two entities, the paper to the journal, and then the data set to the data repository. There's a bidirectional linking in place so that the two DOIs can link to each other, and then you can visualize where this data in particular is somewhere in the ocean off of the coast of Brazil. So you can see at least the data sets associated. And you can have a richer experience of this data set if you go to the data repository. I think there are much better systems of doing that, and in fact, some of my colleagues and a bunch of people at the RDA have the Publishing Data Service Working Group who are creating a linked data model, and what they want to do is for all publishers, and there are very many groups involved with this, Crossref, DataCite, Australian National Data Service, Thomson Reuters, Elsevier, Wiley, Nature, lots of groups are doing that, to say, why don't we make the links between data sets and papers available outside of any firewall, make them into a linked data repository so that anything that can query RDF triples can access this. And then at least we have a single place where this linking can take place. And I think this is something that makes a tremendous amount of sense that we should all endeavor to work towards, because then at the very least you have a link to a paper. Again, it'd be ideal if the linking was more fine-grained, but you have a link between the data set and the paper available and mineable for everyone. This is quite real already, so anybody interested, please look up this page. My slides are on SlideShare, by the way, and they're all hyperlinked if you want to know anything about any of these groups. All right, so a second main problem that we have touched upon in the symposium today as well is that data, it's very difficult to find data. And when you find it, it's very difficult to integrate it. So PubMed Central, Science Direct, Figshare, they all have data sets that are supplementary to the files. I could go on and link add a number of, say, Dataverse or Dryad, etc. But it's very difficult to integrate data sets between these different repositories. There's really no model to do that. So data storage systems currently are very much of the Roach Motel tradition. You know, data checks in, but it never checks out. And so they're not built for knowledge integration. They're built to comply with requirements and data management plans, and that's very important that data is properly stored. But it's not very easy to get anything out, and definitely not to get it out in a format that can be easily integrated. So one solution is, of course, that humans go in and curate the data and present it in a very usable format. This is an example of a database called neuroelectro.org that's curated by one electrophysiology researcher who aims to compile all the information on specific cells in electrophysiology. Another one is PetDB. This is run by Aida at Columbia, creating all the data that is known in geochemistry. But of course there the issue is that manual curation cannot keep up. So this publishing of papers on the one hand and depositing of data sets in disparate data repositories on the one hand, and then having manually curators go through and sift down and connect all the nuggets, it's just a system that isn't really scaling. And in thinking about this issue, I was thinking about what data really needs to be happy. And I was thinking about the Maslows Hierarchy. You probably all know this idea. You know, people need shelter first before they can start on having a fulfilling job, et cetera, et cetera. And I thought it was kind of interesting. You could come up with a Maslows hierarchy for data as well. And so what this slide is meant to say that, first of all, data needs to be stored and preserved, where preserved is more of a long-term commitment, coming back to the question after the previous talk. So it needs to be saved somewhere, even if only on a USB drive in the researcher's drawer, right? That's absolutely the first step. And then I think the next part is that there are components that make it accessible, discoverable, and citable. I do believe, and we've done some experiments on this, and it's a comment I wanted to make after the previous talks as well, that it's quite important when you're trying to convince researchers to start storing and sharing their data, that you first focus on the use that they actually store their data in a way that they can retrieve their own data. So in many labs, in fact, the labs themselves cannot retrieve their own data. And say if a new postdoc comes in, they can't look at the results that were created by other researchers within the same lab. So building systems that allow people to simply store and access their own data, I think is an important first step towards sharing, because sharing is a big psychological hurdle, I have to say. But so a second layer would be that the data is accessible in some form and then discoverable and citable. And lastly, there's the layer of trust. So having the data be comprehensible, reviewed, reproducible, and ultimately reusable. And I really appreciated the idea of these 3 levels of reproducibility. So there's a lot more to say about that. But I think it's interesting to think about the entire stack of needs that data has. And data needs to be preserved, you know, before it can be cited, for instance. Sometimes we forget about that. And on the other hand, if you want to solve the issue of reusability, you'll have to solve storage first. I know that simply storage is a huge issue for many, many labs yet, so you've got to start at the bottom. What might be better models of data integration? And I greatly appreciate, again, Saeed Choudhury's work and his discussions yesterday. We worked with Matt Brush at Oregon Health Science University, in Portland, and his colleagues, Melissa Handel, who worked on the Vivo ontology, to provide a semantic model for what's called the research object. And there was a question yesterday, I think by Merce, about that. We're using it internally to base data integrations within and outside of Elsevier on, but this work will all be presented very soon to the Data Discovery Index, which the NIH is funding, to use as a metadata model for that. And it's meant to be an open basis for work that's done within the Aegis of Force 11 as well. And Matt really looked at the many data standards that there are. There are many semantic models for research data at the moment. One thing that it's probably too small to read, but he's very much distinguishing between the objects themselves, the data points themselves, and the processes that were followed to get to these artifacts. So separating out the creation, the method of obtaining the object, and then the object itself. And he came up with an ontology that can be used, or something that can be used very widely to connect different formats of a research object. So if you have an electronic lab notebook on the one hand, you have, let's say, a methods section within an article, and then you have a data repository. You want to connect all these things into one queryable entity, and that's what this is a model for. Matt is going to be, there's no hyperlink here because Matt is wrapping up first version of a paper, but as soon as it's there, if you're interested, please write me and I'll make sure to send the link, or I'll put the link online as soon as I can. Other work that actually was discussed in this same room last week, and a symposium that Merce Croces and her colleagues organized for Dataverse, is done within the Fairport project by Mark Wilkinson in Madrid. And FAIR stands for Findable, Accessible, Interoperable, and Reusable. And that's a much better and easier acronym for the types of layers that I was trying to show. It's quite complex, and I won't go into any details, but just refer you to the website. But basically, what Mark has done, utilizing semantic technologies, is develop a way that you can access different data and article repositories through a common schema without requiring any extra effort from the underlying repositories. So it's quite a clever way to map data sets that have been modeled in very different schemas and that have very different formats, but to still build a unifying architecture that allows you to link between them and to find them. So again, I urge you to check this out if this is something you're interested in. He's got it working for a number of repositories, but he's very much looking for use cases. So anyone who's interested, it would be great for you to connect to Mark. A third problem, and I was really very, it was wonderful to see Saeed point out this point as well, because I think it's one of the key problems that we're collectively facing, is that scientific software is really not up to standard at the moment. This is typical scientific software, and it looks like it's, whoops, like it's from, oh, how do I go back? Oh, sorry. Right, there we go. It looks like it's from, that says outdated, by the way. It looks like it's from the 70s or 80s, you know, it doesn't look modern. And at the same time, the software that we use for finding objects in our daily life is so ubiquitous and so fantastic that all I was trying to do was come up with a screenshot for a slide, and I ended up browsing both Amazon and Google for random things that I was looking for. It's so good at knowing what you want. And I think that's great on the one hand. On the other hand, I think it's absolutely horrendous to think that the tools that are fed to me to sell me shoes, because I had the same example actually, constantly getting shoe ads for shoes I really like and I actually want to look at. And I'm like, how is it possible that they have any idea what kind of shoes I like? And at the same time, say an oncologist treating a patient in a hospital has tools that are 20 years in development behind it, and that are maybe you know, 0.1% of the amount of money spent on selling me shoes is spent on building tools that allow doctors to treat patients or scientists to build new discoveries. So I think we are immensely behind in scientific software from where the consumer market is right now, and really what Said proposed to make large conglomerates that have many different types of players, I think is the only way, because it's essential that we start catching up there. One project I'm involved with to talk about sustainability is the working group for the RDA to look at the cost recovery for data repositories. I'm co-chairing that together with Ingrid Dillo of DANS in the Netherlands and Simon Hodson of CoData. We're interested in allowing data repositories to tell us what their new potential funding models they're looking at, and to start sharing this knowledge, because there are many small and threatened data repositories. They're asked or told to look for new funding models, but in some cases they're not even paid for the time to look for new funding models. That's one of their conundrums, in fact. So we interviewed 24 repositories on their current and future ideas of funding. And we're currently working on summarizing these stories. We're looking for help in this. Merce has kindly offered help from the Institute for Quantitative Social Science. But if anybody is interested, we're very interested in people who will look at a draft of this, who might be people who would be interested in these outcomes. If you would be interested in helping us, we'd be very grateful. There's an example. We have asked them questions, say, how long do you think your funding is stable for? So 1 year, 3 years were very common answers. What do you know about the future of funding? This is what the report is about. And I think there are other collaborations that we could use to get to thinking about better ways of building scientific software. As Susan already mentioned, I'm involved in Force 11. It's a multi-stakeholder, member-driven organization that is meant to be a platform for scholars, tool developers, librarians, publishers, funding agencies, and others to talk about new forms of science scholarly communication. And the way it works is in two ways. There are working groups with a very clear deliverable. We had a data citation working group that came up with a set of principles, which again, Merce was very instrumental in. Resource Identifier Initiative, which has actually implemented a set of resource identifiers with 5 publishers and I believe 30 journals at the moment. So because you have all the parties in the room, it's quite easy to get something implemented. Working on a lot of new projects. One of them is software citation. The next conference, and that's the other way we work, is through conferences, is going to be in April in 2016, organized by Melissa Handel, and Robin Champios at the library there is helping her with that. And another group that I'm involved in is the National Data Service. I'm on the steering committee there, which aims to be a connective tissue between data creators, curators, storers, etc. And here there are projects, pilot projects that they're inviting, where 2 or more partners who have not worked together but are interested in collaborating are asked to submit a pilot project. So this is really supercomputing cyber infrastructure. So there's space, there's very high bandwidth connections, those types of things. And they're looking for projects where, say, a data creator and a data repository, or an electronic lab notebook and a data curator can work together using this infrastructure. I put it in bold. It needs more involvement from the library community. There are a lot of tool builders. There are not a lot of use cases at the moment. So I strongly urge you to check that out, go to the website, and see if that might be something that you'd be interested in. The next meeting will be here in Harvard in October, and I believe the dates are 19 to 21. So in case you're interested, watch this space. So in summary, and I'll stop there, this is actually the page of the first philosophical transaction, giving an account of the present undertakings, studies, and labors of the ingenious in many considerable parts of the world. And I think that's something that we should all want to do. And thank you so much for your time. I have to run off right after this session, but I'd love to be in contact with any of you. And I think there's time for 1 or 2 questions. Thank you.
Would you like to take a few questions?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, great. Okay, we do have time for a few questions before our next speaker. Dr. Edwards, are you going to, do you have a question? Yes.
Yeah, I was just, your point about data quality of databases for science and for healthcare being so much worse there. I mean, what's driving that? There obviously are not enough incentives, perhaps, or
Well, I don't think the quality of databases. I think the software tools. If you look at, I think I heard somewhere that Google now has 500 full-time people who all they do is develop the knowledge base that underlies what things are positioned on the right-hand side of the page. So like the picture I had of John Perry Barlow, if you query somebody and Google identifies it as a person, they provide some basic, and schema.org, which was mentioned yesterday, comes into play here, but they provide some basic information on that entity. So they figure out what the entity is. They have a whole staff of 200 people working only on user intent. What do they think you mean by your query? You know, there is no comparison in any part of the scholarly world. Certainly Elsevier doesn't have it. None of the publishers have it. The universities don't have that kind of resources. So I think one thing, I was at an RDA meeting in the data repositories session, and they were bemoaning the fact that they can't hire good, excellent developers because they're all going to industry. And so I think it's a serious point to address. I'm not sure how to address it because the industry salaries are so far away from the academic salaries, and the incentives are so much greater, and the pace is so much faster, and the turnaround time. I mean, these are all things that draw excellent software developers to industry and away from academia, but there is a massive gap right now of, I think, almost 20 years in terms of the quality of the software. And I just think that's a serious issue that collectively we should, I don't have a hard and fast answer, but I think it is something very much to think about and to worry about also. If anybody else has a better idea, I'm happy to hear it, but I think it's a serious point.
Okay. Any other questions?
At the back there, I think.
Yeah, okay, right there.
Anita, this is more of a question, it's a comment. When you were talking about how in papers you have figures and the underlying data is not there, it's just a flat image. First of all, I think that should probably change. I mean, we have all the technology to do so. Yeah. But more importantly, I wanted to tell people that somebody in England, Peter Murray Rust, he's working in a project where he does content mining of the literature. So these are going back all the papers, you know, be PDF or just kind of like raster images, and kind of he's created some tools to lift up the underlying data from the figures. I think it's something to just keep in mind.
I thought you were going to mention Steve Pettifer, because he built a wonderful PDF view where he wrote a great paper called Ceci n'est pas un hamburger, which is very well worth reading, which is exactly about that issue, you know, how will you recreate the cow from the hamburger. And so he's built some great tools as well. I mean, Peter Murray Rust does fact extraction. Yeah. As far as I know, he doesn't go back to the underlying data, which of course ideally would be the case. So I think absolutely, if we had enough people who were able, so I think one component that we need is this linked data repository that's accessible to everyone, linking the data to the paper so that you can find the data. I also think we need the more fine-grained linking, so you can say for this figure, this particular data set was used. And then you could easily, for instance, build tools that generate the visualization that to humans looks as a figure from the data set that you then upload behind the paper or in parallel to the paper so that you could go back into the data. We've done a couple of small experiments with something we call the executable paper, and there's some other experiments in different places, but I think you really want the more extensive data repository, not just the table that you can then visualize and play with, but really the data that's underlying these points. I absolutely agree. It can be done, it should be done. It's back to who will build it and how will it work, so yeah.
Right.
Okay, one more? Or?
Yeah.
I don't know if you have a perspective on this, but given this observation that the medical or the scientific tools are so far behind, and some of the biggest money coming into major innovations is actually from giants in software who decide they need to become philanthropic with their riches. What's your perspective on why Bill and Melinda Gates aren't taking these on, or?
Well, I think in some cases they actually are, right? I think there are some very interesting initiatives. One that I can mention is Cancer Commons. I don't know if any of you have heard of this. So this is actually, there's somebody called Marty Tenenbaum who was an AI researcher and then became an internet entrepreneur and a billionaire who then got melanoma, quite severe melanoma. And he realized, and he spent 2 years looking for an alternative treatment for his particular cancer and realizing that the systems to find these treatments are in no way at the level that they should be. So the systems for patient information of new treatments and also the systems for doctors to find treatments that kind of unify all the outcomes that have been found for a particular treatment for a particular patient category are not where they could be, and he knew this because he had built it in a different domain. So he started this foundation called Cancer Commons that he funded, and there is more funding coming into that, which I think is a great initiative and a great example of how he's pulling in some of the Silicon Valley funding into this. One of his issues is to get the hospitals and the medical researchers to work with him on this, because they don't see an immediate benefit to them. If it's a system that's sharing knowledge with patients, yes, there is a general idea that that's a good idea, but of course it'll cost them time. So one of the things that he's now trying to figure out is what are the drivers to actually get, in that case, the medical research community to participate on this. So I agree, it would be very interesting. I mean, Zooniverse, you can argue, is another one, although that's not privately funded as far as I know. But it would be interesting to think of particular projects where you could actually make a difference and really move the needle forward by a great degree.
Okay, last two questions for Dr. De Ward. Marseille?
Yes, Anita, well, we're good friends, so don't take that wrongly. But I think it's unfair to say that the scientific software in academia, well, in general, is 20 years behind. I think it only takes a few resources. I mean, you can very, very easily, with the knowledge and the work that is done in academia, just take a few more resources that come from a professional world. I've been in both, so as a software developer in both, and I've seen that, and it would take only a few months to catch up. So it is not this 20-year difference. It's a resource problem of bringing the right professional developers to work with scientists, and it would come. The change could be caught up much quicker than that.
That's it. Well,
yeah.
so two things. First of all, I did not in any way, shape, or form mean to insult or put down academic developers. I very much mean to we need to put the hand on our own chest. The publishers are way behind. All of science publishing, again, if you compare finding something on Amazon or Google, it is so much better than generally how you can find, say, a data point in science or something like that. So that's one comment. The other thing is, I do think that there to a certain degree, yes, the basis of the systems are there, but there's so much hard slugging labor that goes into so many of these systems. So Watson is an example, right? So Watson is really state of the art, and there were a lot of scientists involved, but it took IBM to actually get there, because there were so many iterations needed to get to a point where it was really able to compete. And I just think that's...
Google has tried to search data, and they haven't succeeded. So it's not a problem that we don't have the right the right capacity, technology, or professionals to do a good job. It's a problem of the ecosystem of data, for example, of software or scientific software.
I'd like to argue it's both.
But
yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Last question, Chris.
Certainly, the skills are there in academia, but the effort, the relentless effort and the manpower, I think, is certainly not.
Hi, Anita.
Hi.
We're friends too. I actually just want to make a plug for the library in the sense for helping with the usability of the software. It actually has had, in my case, we've had a positive impact on some of the you met a group, HiTran group,
Right.
which was impacted by some of the usability advice we'd given them, and also, I remember back in the day, I was talking to Mercedes about, working with the library to improve usability as well. But I know that the ADS, the Astrophysics Data Systems, has benefited from usability studies in the library. I really believe that the library can help in some way in usability of some of these the scientific software, yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I would love for the librarians or libraries to be more well represented in some of these big data groups. So the Data Discovery Index effort by the NIH and then the National Data Service. And often somebody in the room says, oh, maybe we should have librarians, and then everybody goes on, So I think, yes, please participate and come, because there are not enough people representing researchers with a structured viewpoint, not enough people who are used to thinking about information and presenting it to scientists, which is exactly what librarians do, and it's a very critical role. So yeah, I agree. All right,
Great.
thanks.
Thank you very
Thank you.
much. Thank you. Okay. All right. All right, our next panelist is Dr. Scott Edwards. Dr. Edwards received his undergraduate degree from Harvard University and his Ph.D. from the University of California at Berkeley. He did postdoctoral research as an Alfred P. Sloan postdoctoral fellow in molecular evolution at the University of Florida in Gainesville. He later served as an assistant professor in the Department of Zoology at the University of Washington at Seattle, where he was also curator of genetic resources at the Burke Museum. He moved to Harvard in late 2003, and he is currently the Alexander Agassiz Professor of Organismal and Evolutionary Biology and the curator of ornithology in the Museum of Comparative Zoology, where he continues efforts to unite genomics and natural history, and also is very involved in outreach and working with students at all levels. And also wanted to mention that Dr. Edwards was elected as a fellow of the American Ornithologists Union in 2006, elected as a fellow to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and the American Association for the Advancement of Science in 2009, and in 2015 as a fellow to the U.S. National Academy of Sciences. And Dr. Edwards is going to bring a unique perspective today to his talk, because he not only is a faculty member and researcher at Harvard, but he has served for the past 2 years as a rotator at the National Science Foundation. And for those of you who are not familiar with that particular role, Dr. Edwards went down to NSF and he was a program officer in I think it was the Biological Sciences Directorate, is that correct? And so he's going to be able to talk to you about someone who, from the perspective of actually reviewing data management plans as well as developing data management plans. So I think it will be very informative. Dr. Edwards?
Thank you, Sue, and thanks everyone. Thanks to the organizers for inviting me. It's great to be here. Very interesting symposium. Yeah, as Susan mentioned, I'd like to give you a perspective on data management from a biologist. I'm an evolutionary biologist. I deal with many different kinds of data. And yes, I've also had a couple recent experience at the National Science Foundation, serving as one of the division directors of one of the 4 divisions in the bio group. And it was a really interesting experience, sort of, formally trying to get money out of NSF and then getting inside and helping give it away. But it's, and I learned a little bit about, in the Division of Biological Infrastructure, about some of the ongoing initiatives and mandates and how NSF is responding to them. And this is simply a slide which I think captures some of what I hope to convey to you today. And just throughout the symposium, we've talked about the life cycle of data, how some databases are excellent at preserving. In many ways, that's sort of the foremost criterion. But then, in biology, certainly, we're getting now to a point where we're beginning to integrate. And this is, I think, where it begins to get really exciting. Not only is data accessible, but it can be compared and integrated across many different kinds of data sets with many different kinds of data. So this symposium also comes at an opportune time with regard to NSF, because I think, as many of you know, they just released their open access policy to data access just a few months ago. And this also was a response to the OSTP memo of 2010 that you heard about in one of the earlier presentations. And it's, in many ways, much of what's in this document was already being done by NSF, but it's also forward-looking in the sense of really trying to increase transparency and increase retrievability and increase, ultimately, accountability and reproducibility for data that's funded through NSF. In fact, it's leveraging many existing resources out there. And so one of the repositories that it's hoping to utilize and to direct NSF-funded researchers to is the PAGES database run by DOE. And this, I haven't actually looked at it myself. I gather it's a place where publications can be deposited. And so instead of sort of inventing their own new thing that will take a challenge for a new community, they're going to look to DOE to help them jumpstart their open access policy. And the hope is that publications within a year of being published, the data and those publications will be freely accessible through the internet. Now, there's a variety of scales of investment that NSF makes in many different areas of science. I'm most familiar with biology. And one of the largest investments comes from this. It's the National Ecological Observatory Network. Sorry, that last word is covered up. It's basically a continent-scale set of environmental sensors, about 116 in all, that will essentially begin to stream, live stream data as it's being collected from the environment, as well as from researchers in the field. It's exciting in many ways because it's allowing ecologists to scale up from what you can imagine were just sort of individual studies in one place at one point in time to a highly integrated and multifaceted set of data streams. There's going to be over 500 different kinds of data collected. And in addition to that, they'll have field samples, of things like insects and small rodents. And all of this data, the challenge for NEON was to make it all the data immediately available to the community almost in real time. And so this is an example of, it's actually not even finished being constructed. They're still constructing some of these sensors. And yet the data is already online and available. You can see you can sort it by location and date, et cetera. And this is really empowering ecologists to collaborate and to use and reuse really interesting data. Another initiative that's across all of NSF is the BRAIN initiative, which was sort of announced in 2013 by President Obama. This is a emphasis in collaboration with many other federal agencies, NIH and DOE as well. And the hope here is to certainly to increase our understanding of the workings of the brain, but it's also to emphasize the development of neurotechnologies, ways to monitor brain activity at a scale that isn't possible right now. And of course, when you're dealing with new ways of collecting data, you're immediately talking about new ways of storing the data and making it accessible. And so some of the most interesting sort of lead-ups to the ramping up of the BRAIN initiative at NSF have involved asking the community about their data management needs. As you can imagine, with many kinds of imaging, many of the images produced are very data-rich, very large, and there's a real need right now to make accessible at a national, international level this sort of neuroscience data, which really hasn't caught up in some ways with other fields of biology. Synthetic biology is another sort of cross-NSF initiative that is going to require substantial investments in data management. And synthetic biology, of course, is it's sort of moving beyond the sort of descriptive phase of biology, which one could, I think, justifiably characterize most of the 20th century, to a phase in which scientists and engineers are actually building biological entities to test their function. So they're essentially creating new kinds of organisms, either for industrial uses or for learning about the basic workings of biology. And there's some exciting, NSF is playing a big role in synthetic biology, and one of the interesting projects funded by the Division of Biological Infrastructure was essentially a work environment for synthetic biologists. This is from a PI at Boston University, and it's allowing, as you can see here, the storage and the exchange of information dealing with different aspects of synthetic biology. It's interesting because synthetic biology goes all the way from wet lab bench kinds of studies to mathematical modeling, and engineering, and equations. And so allowing researchers to share this information and combine it in new ways is a key component of this initiative. Now, just to zoom in a little more into the focus at NSF on biology, the Division of Biological Infrastructure, as I mentioned, is one of 4 divisions in biology that deals with many different kinds of infrastructure, both physical infrastructure, but also human infrastructure in the form of education and outreach. And this is just sort of an overview of the biology directorate. Of course, it's one of 7 directorates at NSF. It is, here we are right here in DBI, and I would say that more so than the other 3 divisions, DBI has a very, very important mandate to provide tools that will allow research to be accelerated. And of course, some of the programs that I'll tell you about, in many ways, they were on the data management train a lot earlier than the rest of biology. This is just an overview of the many programs run through biological infrastructure. As I mentioned, you've got human resources as well as research resources. Also, we deal with these very large centers, and some of you may have encountered NSF-funded centers in your own work. These centers come in many different flavors. Some of them are called synthesis centers, essentially getting people together, getting communities together. Others are research and technology centers where actually new science and new data is being generated. All of these, however, have substantial data management needs. And in fact, one of the things I learned at NSF is that really well-crafted data management and databases can essentially help form scientific communities. They really can empower new collaborations. That's, I think, a good ideal for any good management system. Now, I wanted to begin by telling you about some of the educational aspects of DBI, because actually in the area of education is, I think, one way in which libraries could play a very important role, sort of as a clearinghouse for resources for teachers, educators, et cetera. And one interesting program in the division was these so-called research coordination networks, which essentially are trying to get researchers together to talk, in this case, about best practices in terms of undergraduate biology education. And they've got, their essential role is to share best practices and to help biology sort of transform itself, specifically with regard to this document here, which, as many of you may know, is really sort of set the agenda for the next decade or so in terms of how biology is taught. Much more hands-on learning, much more experiential learning, much less sort of lecturing in front of the classroom. And so these research coordination networks, I was fortunate to participate in one of them, have as their goal to disseminate best practices of biology education. And I think libraries could play a very useful role in essentially allowing increased access to the resources produced by these networks. Many of them come in the form of lesson plans or other roadmaps to accessing online databases. This particular coordination network was focusing on the use of museum collections in undergraduate biology education. Now, the sort of signature program in biology at NSF, but also really across NSF as a whole, that focuses on data management is the Advances in Biological Informatics program. And just down on the bottom, I've outlined a number of the kinds of databases in biology that have been funded through this program. And it's really fascinating to watch biology transform from sort of, as we heard in the previous talk, an individual laboratory exercise to one in which whole teams of scientists are collaborating, often via these very catalytic databases. And these are the best kind of database is one that makes data accessible, easy to navigate, and essentially puts researchers in touch with each other so that they can benefit from their own expertise. And so biological informatics is followed in many ways and sort of being expanded upon in the general form of digitization. And so digitization certainly includes much of the sort of metadata that surrounds a typical scientific research project, but it also includes many of the actual objects of research itself. And this is a very exciting trend in biology now. We've got a number of different programs that are allowing not only capturing of the essential sort of visual nature of scientific objects, but increased ability to analyze those images. And it's a very ambitious project which has really been catalyzed, again, by sort of a federal mandate, again, from the Office of Science and Technology Policy, which essentially tasked the federal agencies with coming up with more transparent, more accountable ways of sharing their federal collections. Many federal agencies have incredibly valuable, incredibly old, incredibly unique federal collections, which of course are a complement to the many collections which are found throughout the country at universities and private institutions, including Harvard right here. And so much of the digitization work at NSF has sort of flowed from this initial mandate. The federal agencies are responding with some of their databases include this one called Bison, which has a large number of mostly biological but also geological specimens archived. And the real challenge right now is to sort of make common standards for the databases that are going to be germane to the federal agencies versus those that are funded by places like NSF in most of the universities and public universities across the country. We've gotten a lot of input from community working groups, and I think much of the best databasing and digitization will come from suggestions by the community. And so this document came out in 2013 and was really a sort of a roadmap for what the community, in this case the natural history collections community, can look forward to, what they should aspire to over the next several years in terms of making their data and objects more accessible. And at NSF and in bio, this is sort of materialized in an interesting organization called iDigBio. Essentially, it stands for Digitization of Biological Collections. And many of the new initiatives that are appearing across biology have coordinated such that they're depositing their many different kinds of data and research products into iDigBio. It's housed at the University of Florida. And it's really a clearinghouse, not only for the metadata attached to the millions of scientific and natural history objects across the country, but visualizations of those objects themselves. And so it's unique because it has a very interesting structure wherein there's a central digital repository for all the data, and yet the objects to be digitized, of course we can't fund the digitization of everything. It's just too vast an undertaking right now. But the sort of low-hanging fruit and the high priority items to be digitized are funded through collaborations that are research-driven around particular themes. And so in that way, we can really begin to capture some of the exciting data that will fuel additional research, and yet it can all be funded into this central hub, as it's called. And right here in my own research, I'll sort of transition now to a more personal perspective on data. I've certainly been influenced heavily by my experience in interest in characterizing biodiversity and making that data accessible. And so one of the first things I did after coming to Harvard was to get a NSF grant to digitize the ornithology collection in my case. It's about 360,000 interesting specimens from all over the world. You can essentially travel the globe in these collections. But in addition to these so-called voucher specimens, we also have genomic resources. And so these are samples from which DNA and other biomolecules can be extracted. And the challenge was to put all of that in a very accessible form so that the information could be freely accessible. And that has largely been accomplished thanks to the NSF grant, of course, but also through the dedication of a number of database managers at the Museum of Comparative Zoology. I think Brendan Haley is here in the audience, and others as well. And so now you can search our databases, many highly granular data, different kinds of genetic information, geographic information. We can map it onto the landscape. And this has really made, projects like this have made natural history collections across the country increase their value enormously. And essentially they've exposed centuries of collections, and before which time they really were inaccessible. Now, in again, thinking more about evolutionary biology, just thinking of examples of what a good database should do. In my field, I tend to collect not only data from the whole organism, but also genetic data that I want to compare to similar genetic data from other species. I want to be able to map those differences across the tree of life. And what we're seeing now in biology is a number of databases which are not only allowing us to look at biological data in extraordinary detail, but also to begin to synthesize it and integrate it across fields. And so this is a screenshot from a database called the UCSC Genome Browser. It allows sort of a landscape view of the genome of the chromosomes, but also zooming in so you can actually see the actual letters in that nucleotide code, which encoding different kinds of genes and other landmarks in the genome. This is a primarily an NIH-funded database, but it's an extremely useful way of making this sort of data accessible. NSF has funded a variety of informatics projects, again in the area of biodiversity, which are really not only allowing researchers to look at data in more detail, but essentially opening up to the public and with a very extensive outreach component. You can see here, this is called the Open Tree of Life. It's essentially a framework for allowing access to the data and the family relationships of the 1.2 million currently described species, and that number is expected to escalate in the upcoming years. It essentially allows you to zoom in, traverse the tree of life in its entirety, and ultimately to connect to a variety of databases that yield either the kind of genomic information I showed you on the previous slide or other kinds of information. Arbor is a type of another type of database that's going to allow biologists to integrate across different kinds of evolutionary data. Again, comparing the way species look, their phenotypes with their genotypes, with their geographic ranges, et cetera. Another very exciting tool, which was just sort of made public a few weeks ago, is called the Map of Life. I encourage you all to download this, put them on your iPads and your iPhones. As you can see here, it's integrating almost 200 different databases. And so allowing folks to just traverse data in a way that wasn't possible before. Essentially, you can use this to land in any spot on Earth. Your GPS unit of your phone will tell the program where you are, and it will generate for you a complete species list of insects, birds, plants, whatever, of the area where you're located. I think it's going to be a fabulous tool for research, but also a very important tool for public outreach and education. And I think I'm done there. I'd be happy to take any questions. So, thank you. Thank you.
Take a few questions.
Yeah, sure.
Okay, we'd like to take questions. Are there any questions? Where is the first question? I'm sorry, raise your hand. Okay, go ahead. Oh, he's coming.
Should we could all sit up
Sure.
here if you want.
Would the other panelists be able
Yeah,
to
why
join, please, in case
Why
there
don't
are
we sit up
additional
here? That'd be
questions?
good, yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Yes,
you.
so my question is for Laura and Scott about these OSTP responses and so forth. And I was just wondering, I've had conversations with other data librarians about how we wish we could be more involved in this process with the agencies. So I was wondering if either of you had thoughts on how our community and your community can advise each other and support each other better.
You mean specifically with regard to sort of federal mandates, or?
Yeah.
That's a good question. You probably have a perspective as well. I think, there are usually community input phases to some of these initiatives, and I think that the trick is to, talk to NSF and talk to other federal agencies, say you'd like to be involved. I mean, there, outside of the normal panel review system for proposals, there's a lot of workshops and that can often feed into these interagency working groups, and that's probably the best way is just to sort of wave your hand and let folks know that you're interested in participating. Because, I can say from the interagency working group on scientific collections that I think honestly much of the expertise there is actually not in the federal government, it's outside. And so they really need to have input from folks in the community. And I think they'd welcome that.
Yeah, I guess I would just add that there are sort of these standard formal mechanisms that the government can receive information. The request for information that the OSTP put out was one that, we received hundreds of responses. Our federal advisory committees is another one that I know the Office of Science uses heavily. I think a more general statement about increasing communication between the library fields and the scientific research fields is probably something, that needs to happen regardless of what OSTP does.
Are there other questions? Okay, down here, please.
I think the data management plan that's in effect right now is great, but what do you see are good next steps? Do you think funding agencies will look for implementations and have that have effect in the future for future funding?
Okay, I can start. I think what the agencies have done so far and what the OSTP memo has instructed us to do is sort of, N=1 in an iterative process. I think that it's great that researchers are learning how to think about data management as part of their research planning. I I don't expect it to necessarily result in greater data preservation and sharing right off the bat. That's probably a later iteration. I think the federal agencies are going to receive a lot of valuable information from the data management plans about perhaps what gaps there are in data management infrastructure, data standards, community, bringing communities together and what's needed to move the field forward. So I think we're all on a learning curve, and so I expect a lot of things to be changing, actually.
Yeah, I would agree. I think right now we're not. I mean, data management plan unless it's a big project for which data is like the core, it's probably not going to make or break your funding possibilities. But federal agencies are using them to learn about the weaknesses in the infrastructure. And now for large infrastructure projects, obviously the data management plan is going to be the core there. And and I think we're reaching an equilibrium essentially where people might not be taking it as seriously now, but it's the accountability and the need to really pinpoint specific databases is going to just increase.
Okay, there's a question here and then right there, please.
Yes, I guess I'm curious about the consequences for PIs, because I think it's kind of an elephant in the room. So you don't submit your data. What will DOE or what will NSF do about it? I mean, you may, the model that I see is that they won't really submit data that's very usable. They'll just kind of do the letter of the law and not really have data that somebody can retrieve and use. So is it going to be a carrot process or a stick process, or what do the PIs who aren't in the room who will go back for funding really have to deal with? Because I think those of us who are in the trenches getting money, once a project is done, you're on to the next project. And cleaning up old data is not a lot of fun. So is it a carrot or a stick? What can we see, anticipate?
I mean, I think I guess I wouldn't put it as carrot or stick. I actually think the culture is changing, and I would submit that younger scientists coming through the ranks now are being trained much better in ways to share their data and to feel comfortable with it. And so I think NSF, there isn't a lot of follow through. There's not a lot of accountability essentially once the money's out the door. But I do think that with this new policy, as it unfolds, the details, it may well be incumbent upon universities to ensure that their data is accessible. And follow up, it's unclear, how that would actually unfold. But I do think it's not so much. I don't think it'll be driven from top down, though. I really think that people will realize that you can actually do better science if you make it available. Once, of course, you've done what you want to do with it.
I just wanted to add that I think there are a couple of examples where also within a specific community, like in the structural biology community, where a large data set was put online, and then the main journals in a certain field all required that the data was deposited in publication. It's just one facet of the whole thing, of course, but that can be a useful component there, perhaps. But it's really on the community to decide, we're all going to deposit our data now, we're all going to share it and reuse it. So I do think it's community by community.
Yeah, I mean, many papers many journals in my field, you can't publish the paper unless you've deposited it in a recognized database. And I'm sure that's true for physics and chemistry and other geology.
Yeah, I think that's all true. I mean, I think that if the enforcement of these ideas comes from entities other than the federal funding agencies, it's probably a lot more robust. But we have said that it may affect future funding applications if you don't follow through with your data management plan.
The panels interchange. Your interchange that just took place may have already answered my question, but the OSTP is from an executive order from the president, which means it can be overturned in the next administration because there's no law that supports it. Is it likely that it's going to be so embedded into the process that some future directive couldn't come down and say, we're just going to eliminate this because it just isn't doable, or we don't want it? Or do you think it's going to be embedded enough into an accepted research practice that a change in the directive could not just necessarily just wipe it out? Because I think that's some of the concern that some people have, or maybe some people are hoping will happen, that a next administration or president or whomever could change the whole policy about this. And I know there's a bill that's trying to get through Congress to make it into a law, but it hasn't made it yet, and we have no great assurance that it ever will.
I don't know who wants to read tea leaves, but I sort of doubt that things are going to change a huge amount. I mean, I really think that, if anything, the federal government is a little bit behind this train, and so, the mechanism by which agencies are sort of deriving the conversation might change. We've decided to use data management plans as the mechanism now. That might change. I don't think the administration would do that, but that might change from agency to agency. But I don't think the trend is going to change.
Yeah, I mean, I would agree. I think science funding in this country is actually pretty bipartisan, and I think that Congress and the executive branch recognize that, accessibility spurs innovation. I think that's a genuine feeling, and when the memo to create better infrastructure and accessibility of scientific collections came out, initially there was all this grumbling. Wow, this is going to be a lot of work, but fundamentally it's a recognition that those resources are of value, and that I think is really important. And so my hunch is that it won't change willy-nilly with administrations. I think it's going to be an ongoing thing.
Chris?
Hi, I have a question. I guess it's funding related again, but just about, so one thing I hear from my community, there's this publication that came out about postdoc experience, mentoring and training for postdocs, and how I guess there's a lot of anxiety about people in the academic community being able to go into, get a job in academia, or can they actually get into industry somehow? And so there's this tension now that I think I'm trying to address in the library is the training aspect, how to become more efficient in your lab, but also how does that transfer to the real world, how they can take this. So like some of the tools that we use are not necessarily transferable, right? And that's something I think, also I think even the NLM, NLM just had a strategic vision about this kind of activity too, about training, changing the culture that way. So I don't know if you have any thoughts from the funding side of things too. Like, is that something you're looking at too, training and things of that sort?
I think from the Office of Science perspective, the worry is that we train people too well and lose them to industry. So there's a big focus in the Office of Science about training people in our mission critical areas and making sure that we keep them in the DOE ecosystem.
Yeah, I would second that. I think at NSF and other federal agencies, I'm sure there's a big recognition that academia is not and should not be the sole, goal for a PhD. And there's a lot of effort in various programs to try to institute this idea of creating better paths to alternate careers. And I know that there's a lot of collaboration among federal agencies to create better portals, better information systems for graduate students to learn about opportunities, in the federal government and elsewhere. And so, so I think we're behind in that way. Of course, faculty are not trained to to teach their students how to do anything other than what they're doing, right? And so it's, but I think federal agencies are trying to put those tools in faculty's hands and to help change the culture as well.
All right, thank you. Thank you very much to our panelists.